China, April 1944. An army almost 400,000 strong rumbles south across the floodplains of the Yellow River. The planners labeled it, without poetry, Ichi-Go, Operation Number 1. For the soldiers who marched under that banner, the legacy would be mud-choked roads, clouds of malaria, and a countryside left in ruins. Operation Ichi-Go will carve a corridor 1,600 kilometers long, swallowing dozens of cities before the year's out. It will touch market towns that have traded silk for thousands of years, choke rivers with the dead, and cut the Beijing-Hankou Railway the way a knife parts bamboo. Yet, outside of China, its name will all but vanish from memory, eclipsed by Normandy beaches and Pacific Island chains. 500,000 Japanese troops drove a 1,600 kilometer rail spear straight through central China, burning city after city, while the rest of the world scarcely took note. For the villager who saw the horizon turn black, it didn't matter what the campaign was called, only that the war had arrived all at once. He shoulders his mother, grips his little sister's wrist, and walks toward mountains he hopes the guns cannot climb. In the space of one season, millions of Chinese civilians will be displaced or killed. So why did Tokyo launch this colossal gamble in the spring of 44? Why did commanders believe they could break China's spine after 7 grinding years of stalemate? And how did an offensive of such magnitude slip through the cracks of global memory? This is the story of Japan's Barbarossa, the largest land campaign the rising sun ever dared, and the ghosts it left behind. By the winter of 1943, the war in China had entered its 7th year and settled into a stalemate that satisfied no one. Japanese forces held a long ribbon of territory that included most major ports, most of the main rail corridors, and a chain of river cities stretching from Manchuria to Canton. Yet, control often ended a few kilometers beyond the last station sighting. Guerrillas cut telegraph wires, local militias ambushed road convoys, and entire counties changed hands constantly. The Imperial Army could capture almost any objective it chose. What it could not do was convert those sieges into a decisive collapse of Chinese resistance. Frustration at headquarters in Tokyo grew as the global picture darkened. American shipyards were producing cargo vessels faster than Japanese submarines could sink them, while US submarines were doing the opposite to Japan's own merchant fleet. In the Pacific, island garrisons that once formed a protective perimeter were falling in sequence. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, allowing Allied airfields to inch closer to the home islands. On the Asian mainland, the newest threat came from the US 14th Air Force, whose small but fast-growing group of American bombers had begun launching raids from freshly scraped runways in interior China. Those bombers could threaten the Japanese heartland, something unthinkable only a year earlier. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, a consensus formed that the trend lines had to be broken before mid-1945. If the nationalist government in Chongqing remained in the war, American forces would always have a continental foothold, first for bombers, later perhaps for ground troops. The phrase that circulated among planners summed up the logic with brutal clarity. If China stands, the ring around Japan will close. And so, during staff meetings held in November and December 1943, a single proposal rose to the top of every briefing binder. The architect of the plan, Lieutenant General Okamura Yasuji, commanded the North China Area Army and had spent years watching his divisions fight hard for ground that seemed to dissolve behind them. His remedy was scale. Instead of limited mopping up sweeps, he recommended one continuous offensive that would start at the Yellow River, roll down the Beijing-Hankou Railway, pivot through Hunan, and finish on the Guangdong coast. By linking the northern and southern occupation zones, the army would create an inland corridor almost 1,600 kilometers long. Every American airfield in central China would fall inside that belt. Every Chinese army trying to defend it would be chopped into isolated segments. Okamura estimated the job would take 3 months and require roughly 500,000 troops backed by large railway repair teams. At Chongqing, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek received fragmentary intelligence about Japanese rail surveys and troop concentrations. He had problems of his own. Inflation inside nationalist-held territory was so severe that soldiers' monthly pay lost value before they could spend it. American Lend-Lease supplies arrived only by flying the hump over the Himalayas, an operation that burned nearly its own weight in aviation fuel for every ton delivered. Worse, Chiang's best formations were tied down guarding the approaches to the provisional capital. Moving them north toward Henan would expose his political center. Concluding that Japan might be a limited demonstration rather than a full-scale push, he decided to stretch thin units across the likely fronts and keep reserves in the interior. It was a gamble, and in April 1944, it turned catastrophic. Farther north, at Yan'an, Mao Zedong studied the same rumors and bided his time, waiting for the right opportunities. A massive Japanese thrust, he told his guerrilla commanders, would force the Kuomintang to retreat, discredit its claim to protect the nation, and allow communist organizers to expand in the countryside left uncovered. Guerrilla units marked culverts, bridge trusses, and fuel dumps along the Beijing-Hankou line, preparing charges they would detonate once Japanese trains began to roll. American commanders watched the developing situation with mounting concern. Claire Chennault's 14th Air Force, small though it was one of Washington's only means of striking Japan. If those plateau airfields in Henan fell, bomber crews would have to stage from bases hundreds of kilometers deeper in China or abandon the theater outright. The War Department authorized additional shipments of bombs, spare parts, and aviation gasoline, but every flight over the Himalayas risked storms and Japanese interception. While headquarters made their final preparations, civilians on the North China Plain figured out what was coming. Railroad depots, usually quiet in winter, buzzed with activity. Draft horses disappeared from villages at night, led away by requisition teams who left receipts nobody expected to redeem. Buddhist temples filled with worshippers chanting for peace. Farmers restacked grain in hidden alcoves or loaded cartwheels with extra grease for a quick departure. Many had lived through the scorched-earth campaigns earlier in the war and trusted rumor more than official assurances. On the morning of the 17th of April 1944, Japanese guns opened up across the Yellow River near Zhengzhou, their fire covering the first assault boats that nosed through the mist. The barrage didn't last long, just enough to stun the Chinese outposts on the north bank. Yet, by early afternoon, advanced elements of the Japanese 12th Army were reported on the southern shore, and engineer units were already laying pontoon spans to bring light tanks and supply trucks across. Chinese defenders, largely units of the 31st Army Group, sent urgent signals back to Henan Front headquarters describing their flank as broken and unable to form a second line. With few mobile reserves in the province, nationalist staff could only warn Chongqing that the Yellow River barrier had failed. Messages arrived piecemeal. Some spoke of infantry columns, others mentioned tanks, and the traffic added to the confusion in the provincial capital. Villagers along the line reacted according to experience. Some families hid in earthen cellars, planning to wait out whatever came. Others heaved quilts and millet onto ox carts and started walking west, reasoning that distance, not fortitude, offered the better odds of survival. Within 48 hours, the scale of the operation became unmistakable. Japanese reconnaissance planes overflew rail junctions well south of the river, mapping routes their own ground units had not yet reached, confident that the advance would catch up. Nationalist troops trying to redeploy by road found bridges destroyed by earlier Japanese raids, forcing detours that cost precious hours. Chinese liaison officers attached to forward corps relayed grim assessments back toward Kunming, warning that the line could not be held in its present shape and pleading for permission to establish new defensive positions farther south. By the end of the second day, senior commanders on both sides understood three realities. The Japanese assault had punched through faster than anticipated, Chinese units lacked real-time intelligence to respond, and the psychological shock was already rippling through Henan's frontline garrisons. Yet, the offensive carried early signs of its own vulnerability. Each kilometer captured required guards, track crews, and depot personnel. Fuel consumption for trains proved higher than pre-war planning figures because locomotives had to idle during frequent air raids. The guerrilla teams cut telegraph wires the moment Japanese columns moved on, forcing messengers to ride back to restore communications. These were small annoyances, all things considered, but they accumulated. Details that would matter more as the front extended hundreds of kilometers beyond the Yellow River. For the moment, the momentum belonged entirely to the invader. Supply trains of ammunition and rice rattled south as soon as the rails were repaired, each one evidence that the timetable was still on track. Railway crews scrawled distances and times in chalk on locomotive boilers, trying to measure how much speed the fresh track work had brought them, while infantry riding the flat cars speculated where they would be ordered to disembark next. Operation Ichi-Go had been conceived as Japan's answer to strategic encirclement, a calculated gamble to finish what 6 previous years of war had failed to deliver. With the guns now silent along the Yellow River crossing, its first phase was underway. Destination Luoyang, and after that, the long rail south toward Changsha. How quickly the timetable would hold and what it would cost on both sides were questions that the coming weeks would answer in blood and bent steel. The next stop, Luoyang, offered better walls than weapons. General Li Pin-hsian commanded 25,000 defenders with 2 weeks of rations and half that in artillery shells. The 12th Army encircled the city on the 13th of May, pounded it for 10 days, and blew a breach wide enough for 2 light tanks on the night of the 24th. Resistance ended at dawn on the 25th. According to one refugee, the city walls glowed like a furnace. We took the children to the river, and even the water was tinted red with brick dust. International Red Cross teams later counted roughly 20,000 civilians dead, most victims of fire or building collapse. Phase 1 formally closed a week later, with Japanese patrols reaching the Shahe River, 200 kilometers beyond their start line. Tokyo's communiques noted fewer than 10,000 Japanese casualties. Chinese losses, including units that disintegrated during their retreat, ran 4 to 6 times higher. Beneath the victory reports lay frictions that would haunt every later phase. Each captured kilometer of track needed centuries. Guerrillas from the Communist 8th Route Army lifted spikes or spread the gauge, derailing locomotives and scattering schedules. Henan's flooded coal mines forced quartermasters to burn diesel earmarked for vehicles, and by late June, staff warned that forward depots held under 10 days of fuel. Still, momentum argued for striking immediately at Changsha, Hunan's capital and the nationalists' last fortress on the north-south rail spine. Phase 2 began with 2 improvised pontoon bridges across the swollen Xiang River before dawn on the 11th of June. Changsha had embarrassed Japan 3 times since 1939 under the defense of General Shuyu, the Tiger of Changsha. This time, heavy guns, smokescreens, and a second crossing upstream outflanked his line. After a brief street fight on the 18th of June, the city fell, its wooden market districts already burning from demolition teams and incoming fire. The harder contest came at Hengyang, 160 kilometers farther on, where 17,000 troops under Fang Xuanzhu fortified factory blocks and low ridges guarding the last usable runways of the US 14th Air Force in Hunan. Expecting a quick storm, Lieutenant General Yokoyama Isamu launched a frontal assault on the 5th of July. It failed, as did 3 more attempts. Siege guns, short bombing runs, and night assaults dragged the battle into August. Water, morphine, then rice ran outside the perimeter, yet Fang's men held 48 days. Long enough for Chinese newspapers to hail a moral victory, even as the garrison bled white. Japanese losses, which numbered about 23,000 killed or seriously wounded, were among the worst the Imperial Army ever recorded in a single city fight. Henan eventually fell on the 9th of August, with 1,200 unwounded defenders slipping into the countryside. Victories in Hunan lengthened Japan's corridor, but deepened its supply crisis. Coal factories couldn't meet demand. Field hospitals overflowed with 20,000 fresh Japanese wounded from Henan alone, and malaria cases climbed as far north as the railhead. Even so, High Command ordered Phase 3 without pause. Seize Guilin, Liuzhou, and Guangxi, then pivot east to link with Canton and the South China Sea ports, creating, on paper, an unbroken land route from Manchuria to the Gulf of Tonkin. Both sides understood Guilin's terrain favored the defender. Cast towers squeezed every approach into mapped killing zones, and General Zhang Fakui reinforced trenches with bamboo gabions, while American advisors contributed a few 75mm howitzers and anti-aircraft guns. Yet, ammunition flowed in slower than Japanese columns closed the ring. 2 probing attacks on the 9th and 11th of October were repelled, but each cost shells Zhang could not replace. A flanking Japanese column bypassed the hills entirely, pushing toward Liuzhou and threatening to trap the whole garrison. Kai-shek refused evacuation. Zhang stayed, burned codebooks, and braced for a last stand. Siege guns encircled on the 20th of October. Shortages limited their bombardment, but by the time infantry entered on the 24th, many Chinese positions were already silent. Guilin surrendered on the 27th of October after 21 days, half the duration of Henan, but brutal enough. Japanese units pressed on to near-empty Liuzhou, capturing it on the 7th of November after defenders mined bridges and slipped into the hills. Map lines now showed a red ribbon 1,600 kilometers long, and Tokyo's newspapers hailed the south-north link-up. The ribbon looked thinner on the ground. North of Guilin, half the rolling stock lay wrecked in ravines. Trestles were blasted faster than engineers could patch them. Replacement draftees filled rifle companies with 18 and 19-year-olds who had fired 10 rounds in basic training. Fuel depots meant to brim with local coal held more mud than briquettes. Quartermasters dismantled derailed locomotives for boiler parts, creating hybrid Dragon engines that looked stitched from spare metal. Meanwhile, the US 14th Air Force had already withdrawn to Sichuan. Chiang's nationalist armies avoided encirclement by melting into western hills, while communist guerrillas expanded behind the thin Japanese garrisons left to guard every bridge and tunnel. By year's end, Japanese rail officers admitted that only 1 in 4 freight trains clipped the full Wuhan-Liuzhou run without delay. Cumulatively, the 3 phases cost Japan roughly 100,000 dead and more than twice that wounded or sick. Losses the home islands couldn't replace. Chinese military facilities were higher still, while civilian deaths from shellfire, famine, and forced labor exceeded 300,000 across Henan, Hunan, and Guangxi. Tokyo gained a corridor it couldn't service without draining strength from every other front. When Imperial Headquarters radioed "Objective Achieved" in November 1944, staff officers were already drafting contingency plans for withdrawal should events elsewhere force their hand. 9 months later, Japan surrendered with large detachments still scattered along rails they had fought so hard to seize, garrisons whose main duty by then was guarding culverts and wondering when a train north might come. In hindsight, Ichi-Go scored every tactical goal its architect set. It captured railways, overran bomber fields, linked occupied zones. Yet, it hastened strategic defeat by bleeding veteran units and overstretching logistics. The corridor became a triumph that asked more than an exhausted empire could pay. It was an offensive remembered in China for its devastation, yet nearly forgotten in Japan and entirely absent from Western thought. Kai-shek had lost capitals and depots, yet most frontline units slipped west into hill country where rail-bound Japanese columns could not pursue at speed. The moment Ichi-Go paused, nationalist and communist guerrillas began nibbling at its flanks, derailing work trains, ambushing bridge guards, kidnapping surveyors. By January 1945, a freight run that should have taken 26 hours from Wuhan to Liuzhou averaged 48, if it ran at all. Washington adapted faster. The feared loss of Chinese bomber bases mattered less once B-29 superfortresses left Saipan's coral runways. In December, those aircraft firebombed Nagoya and Osaka, striking Japan from a direction Ichi-Go could not touch. Ichi-Go had gambled everything on denying central China to American air power. American planners simply stepped around the board. Inside Japan, newspapers trumpeted the yellow to southern sea advance, but bread ration coupons shrank again, and schoolchildren ordered to salute the red ribbon on classroom maps also practiced bucket brigades for the air raid wardens. On the ground in China, the human toll deepened. Henan's wheat belt lay cratered and overgrown. Hunan's villages were drafted to rebuild trestles by hand. Guangxi faced typhus in spring and famine at harvest. Provincial archives later counted 200,000 civilian deaths from hunger or disease in Guangxi alone between November 1944 and the Japanese surrender the next August. Propaganda diverged as sharply as experience. Chongqing highlighted Hengyang's 48-day stand as proof that Chinese troops could still bleed the invader. Communist transmitters cast Ichi-Go as evidence that mobile guerrillas would win the future. Tokyo's line fractured when news from other fronts overwhelmed the corridor story. By the spring of 1945, North China Area Army asked permission to pull divisions back from the corridor to guard the coast. Permission never came. The line had become a prestige object no general dared cede, even as it drained the reserves needed to meet the gathering storm. The storm broke on the 15th of August, 1945. Infantry companies scattered along the rails heard the Emperor's voice over captured radios or from mimeographed leaflets dropped by American planes. Chinese militias emerged from hiding to seize depots, sometimes clashing with communist units arriving for the same purpose. The Civil War resumed almost before the foreign occupier stacked its rifles. Long-term effects radiated outward like cracks in glass. For the nationalists, the territorial loss and the humiliation that followed undermined their claim as China's sole defender. For the communists, the Japanese retreat left a power vacuum they filled with seasoned guerrilla cadres. Villagers who had watched partisans sabotage rails now saw those same figures organize rice distribution and reopen burnt schools. The corridor built at such cost became a highway of communist consolidation. In Japan, the name Ichi-Go faded quickly. Official histories favored Pacific Island battles where the Navy and Army shared the stage, not a continental campaign whose gains evaporated within 9 months. Textbooks reduce it to a footnote. Thus, the largest land operation Japan ever launched finished as a paradox, a triumph of timetable and track that sharpened strategic defeat. It scarred China, drained Japan, and tilted the post-war balance toward forces neither side fully reckoned with in 1944. The rails still carry freight through Henan, Hunan, and Guangxi, polished by modern wheels, while rusted culverts and unmarked graves lie just beyond the ballast. When the war ended, the embers of Operation Ichi-Go cooled at very different temperatures in China, Japan, and the West. What had been the largest land offensive in Japanese history drifted into 3 separate kinds of memory: a wound, a reluctance, and a blank. Let's start with the wound. Their stories are specific. A brother taken as a guide and never returned. A grandfather shot for hiding rice. A mother burned when a supply train exploded after guerrillas lifted a single track spike. These details passed from survivor to child, then to grandchild, and they entered county gazetteers, local museums, and village chat groups. The communist state later amplified many of those accounts in textbooks and memorial halls, but the bedrock was personal recollection, stubborn and granular. Drive south to Hunan and Guangxi, and the emphasis changes from private pain to public commemoration. In Hengyang, a modern exhibition center built on the ruins of the 10th Corps Command bunker loops documentary footage of the 48-day siege while visitors walk across glass floors, revealing shell splinters embedded in the masonry below. Visiting school groups often leave with homework sheets that ask them to list Japanese atrocities mentioned in the exhibit and explain why the 48-day defense of Henan is presented as an example of national spirit. The state guides these memories, but didn't invent them. Beginning in the 1950s, Beijing issued a series of county-level gazetteer templates that required a war of resistance chapter. Local editors filled the pages with whatever they knew: casualty counts, names of burned villages, and testimonies copied from the pension applications of widows. Later, when the Cultural Revolution swept away many archives, those gazetteers survived in bedrooms and school offices. After 1978, the party's new priority was patriotic education, and the raw notes found their way back into official print. County histories reissued with glossy dust jackets and color inserts. By the 1990s, most middle school history texts in China discussed Ichi-Go, often in the same chapter as the rape of Nanjing and Unit 731. The message was consistent. The world had forgotten, but China remembered. Now cross the East China Sea, where memory loosens its grip. In post-war Japan, the priority was economic survival and political realignment. Washington needed a stable ally, not a nation lost in remorse, so the first generation of occupation-approved textbooks compressed the entire China theater into a few pages. Battles that had obsessed Japanese newspapers in 1944 became names in parentheses. Zhengzhou, Henyang, Guilin, each followed by a neutral verb like captured or taken. Atrocity reports were omitted altogether. Ichi-Go's complexity also made it inconvenient. It was a strategic success that coincided with looming national defeat, a victory that tasted like ashes even to many officers who had marched the rail line. Easier then for editors to pivot toward Pacific Island engagements, where the narrative could revolve around brave garrisons facing overwhelming odds. As a result, millions of Japanese students finished compulsory education without ever hearing that their own army had once driven nearly to the gates of Canton. When debate over war memory finally erupted in the 1980s, triggered by survivor lawsuits, feminist scholarship on comfort women, and the diplomatic fallout of Yasukuni shrine visits, Ichi-Go surfaced only at the edges. Ichi-Go left almost no film, and the photographs, rail cuts, burned stations, anonymous columns of refugees, failed the test of instant recognition. Absence bred further absence. Even today, the standard Japanese high school text devotes more lines to the invasion of Malaya than to the push across Henan and Hunan. The West, meanwhile, slipped into almost perfect amnesia. Anglo-American historiography of World War II grew from personal experience. Soldiers who fought in Europe, naval officers who served in the Atlantic, Marines who landed on Pacific beaches. Few Westerners in uniform had ever set foot on the Beijing-Hankou Railway in 1944, and fewer still wrote memoirs. Popular histories followed those familiar tracks. By 1960, one could read 500 pages on Stalingrad or Normandy without a single reference to Ichi-Go. Even professional scholars tended to see China through the lens of high diplomacy. Chiang's resistance, American Lend-Lease, the Dixie Mission, the final Civil War. Ichi-Go sat in a citation or two, then vanished behind the avalanche of post-war politics. Collective forgetting carries consequences that linger long after steel rails turn to modern track. In China, the story's prominence reinforces a sense of historical grievance that shapes popular attitudes toward Japan. Every textbook mention, every anniversary exhibit folds personal pain into national identity. In Japan, silence produces different distortions. Younger generations know the empire lost the war, but lack a map of how and how far it once advanced on the mainland. When confronted with Chinese anger, some ask sincerely, "Where is the place you say we burned?" In the West, policymakers occasionally misread the ferocity of Sino-Japanese arguments by missing the ballast of wartime memory beneath each statement. Still, memory isn't static. In 2014, a joint archaeology team from Kyoto University and Wuhan University excavated a collapsed tunnel near Shahe. Japanese and Chinese graduate students knelt side by side, brushing away soil to reveal signal lanterns warped by an explosion that had derailed a coal train 70 years earlier. The press photographs went modestly viral. Former enemies, heads bowed, sharing a trench. For a brief week, the comment threads on both Weibo and Twitter tilted hopeful. Proof, some users wrote, that looking at the same ground together might soften the edges of the story. But that optimism has its limits. Every August, Chinese social media spikes with photographs of wreaths laid at Hengyang and Henan memorials. Every summer, Japanese politicians debate whether certain cabinet members should or should not visit Yasukuni. The rhythm repeats: commemoration, denial, backlash, fatigue. Ichi-Go is never the headline, but its tracks run just beneath the surface of the argument. So, the rail corridor that once carried munitions now carries freight and high-speed passenger trains. Travelers texting from air-conditioned cars rarely notice the older line in the valley below, the one laid under wartime compulsion and patched after every guerrilla blast. The trains slide past the low stone markets that denote mass graves, past embankments where grass grows thicker over soil mixed with cinders and bone. History rides those rails unseen, alive in memory for some, absent for others, restless either way. So, how should Operation Ichi-Go be judged? 75 years of scholarship has turned the question over like a stone, revealing new facets each decade. Yet, the conclusions cluster around a single paradox. The offensive did almost everything its architects demanded and still helped hasten the empire's collapse. The first assessments came from within Japan's own officer corps during the American occupation. Staff college reports compiled in 1946 praised the operational design, converging thrusts, rail-based logistics, calculated use of interior lines, and then pivoted to a blunt verdict. Strategic effect, negligible. Strategic cost, prohibitive. In other words, Ichi-Go succeeded on the map but failed in the war. Those internal memos stayed classified for years, yet later historians found the same pattern in the open record. The offensive silenced Chinese-based B-24s just as B-29s moved into the Marianas. It seized rails that could no longer feed an island nation beset by submarine blockade. It bled divisions that might have opposed the Americans on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Colonel Tanaka Masao, who served as the logistics planner, told an interviewer in 1970, "By the time we reached Luzhu, the war's center of gravity had already shifted to the Pacific. We were strong in exactly the place that no longer mattered." Chinese scholarship followed a different arc, framed less by grand strategy than by political consequence. Early Republican-era writers, many of them ex-nationalist officers living in Taiwan, argued that Ichi-Go broke the Kuomintang's backbone by stripping away central China tax bases and exposing corruption inside the retreating bureaucracy. Mainland historians, writing after 1949, agreed the nationalists suffered, but added that communist guerrilla zones expanded precisely because the Japanese corridor stretched its garrisons thin. By the 1980s, both camps acknowledged that the offensive destabilized Chiang Kai-shek's government far more than it hurt Mao's. The phrase anti-hegemony by proxy entered journal articles. Japan, unintentionally, had weakened the very force Washington hoped would govern China after the war. Social historians point to the human cost. At least 300,000 Chinese civilians dead, with some estimates running higher, 3,000 villages damaged or destroyed, and refugee flows that altered county populations well into the 1950s. Japanese losses, roughly 100,000 dead and double that wounded or sick, further sapped a manpower pool already stretched across Manchuria, the Pacific, and the defense of the home islands. Where historians still disagree is on intent. Was Ichi-Go a calculated gamble gone wrong, or a desperate gesture by generals who knew defeat was inevitable but gambled on buying time? The diaries from Imperial General Headquarters hint at both motives. Some planners wrote of decisive opportunity, while others of final chance to secure bargaining chips. The distinction matters because it colors subsequent debates over accountability. If the campaign was strategic folly from inception, responsibility rises to the highest staff circles. If it was a gamble forced by circumstances, blame diffuses across a system already cornered. Chinese scholars tend to favor the first reading, while Japanese revisionists sometimes invoke the second. The documents allow room for both interpretations, and the argument remains unsettled. One point, however, finds near universal acceptance. Ichi-Go sharpened post-war animosity in ways neither side foresaw. The nationalists blamed their eventual civil war defeat partly on the losses of 1944. The communists credited their victory to the guerrilla groundwork laid during the same months. In Japan, silence about the campaign left younger generations ill-prepared for the intensity of Chinese grievance. Each anniversary of Luoyang, Changsha, or Henan thus arrives with asymmetric knowledge. One public remembers burial mounds, the other recalls almost nothing. A gap that fuels every fresh controversy over textbooks, museum exhibits, or diplomatic language. That legacy reaches into contemporary policy even when politicians avoid the history by name. Chinese calls for proper recognition of wartime suffering implicitly include Ichi-Go's devastation. Japanese statements of remorse rarely mention the operation. Operation Ichi-Go ended in August 1945, but the questions it raised about proportionality, occupation, and the unintended paths of victory remain provisional, waiting for each generation to open the file. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.